my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce to you one of the most respected orators of our time, and I will tell you, I am very thankful I'm speaking before Ambassador Keyes and not after Ambassador Keyes, because nobody wants to speak after Ambassador Keyes. His eloquent advocacy for our constitutional republic and championing of pro-liberty, pro-life principles underscores his recognition and respect for the moral basis of freedom and self-government. As many of you recall, Ambassador Keyes had the pleasure of serving in the Reagan administration as ambassador to the United Nations Economic and Social Council and as an Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, also serving on the staff of the National Security Council. He's an unwavering defender of the American people, their God-given unalienable rights and their sovereignty over their persons, property, and their government. He's fought to limit government, secure our borders, abolish the federal income tax, rein in an expansive executive branch and activist federal judiciary, and to build banking and financial systems that halt the looting of America's wealth. He serves as a national spokesman and a tireless champion and advocate for constitutional protection of the innocent unborn. He serves as a national spokesman for the pro-life personhood movement and supports crisis pregnancy centers, which, as many of you know, was near and dear to my recently deceased wife, and I appreciate for your support for their crisis pregnancy centers. In addition, he chairs several activist grassroots organizations as well as federal political action committees, including the Conservative Majority PAC and the Patriot PAC. He was host of his own nationally syndicated radio show, The Alan Keyes Show, America's Wake-Up Call, for many years, and in 2002 went on to host his own MSNBC show. A little worried about that MSNBC part. Alan Keyes is making sense. He's also authored 2 books, Masters of the Dream, The Strength and Betrayal of Black America, and Our Character, Our Future. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Alan Keyes.
Captain, I haven't actually had any business up here for quite some time. And I think that that is symbolic of the situation that the country finds itself in. Because I have mostly been working with people at the grassroots. And though occasionally, these days, folks who are still of a mind to believe that the political leadership at presently in control of our political process actually represents something that can, in fact, be influenced by the votes and opinion of the people. A lot of the folks that I deal with fight against a despairing conviction that this is no longer the case. And I have to tell you that, in spite of the results of the last election, I think that it's not entirely clear whether this little room, for instance, represents a niche for the true spirit of representation in our republic that's on its way in, or fatally on its way to the final demise of that whole concept of government. And nothing about the choice between the Democrat and Republican parties says anything to that fundamental question. And that's the tragedy of our time. Because in a general kind of way, the political elite, and not only the political elite, but economic elite, professional elites, throughout our society have abandoned the vision of self-government on which the United States of America was founded. They are doing so more and more openly, more and more explicitly, on both sides of the aisle. And that is especially evident in the way they speak or refuse to speak about the issues of fundamental American principle on which the fate of the republic depends. What is intriguing and very important about this past election is that even though in certain instances a turnout of, for instance, pro-life and voters who understand the importance of the fundamental principles of God-endowed right was critical to the success of Republicans who will end up serving in the Congress and the Senate of the United States, those considerations were not at all critical in the mind of the leadership strategists as they approached the primaries and as they did everything in their power to declare war on the grassroots constituency of conservatives, and are now in the aftermath of a victory that, between you and me, they did not in and of themselves deserve. They are taking pains to make it clear that though at the polls, the Obama faction, the Obama administration, the so-called change promised by President Obama, and all of the appurtenances that go along with it have been rejected and repudiated by the electorate. What is the byword of the GOP leadership? Well, we have to move forward in those areas where we agree. The people have said, we have no confidence in this president. We have no confidence in this administration. We must take the majority from the hands of the party that inflicted this administration upon the free people of the United States. And one would think that the first words out of the mouth of the people who were elected as a result of that kind of a mandate would be to make clear that that accountability, which has not been in evidence for the last several years, will now become the chief concern of the Congress which is supposed to represent the people of the United States. Is that what we have heard? Actually, not at all. Quite the contrary. Is this an accident? Is it a circumstance? Is it a tactic? Sadly, I don't think so. Because the election victory for the Republicans that was big should have been overwhelming. The American people had a strong desire, like somebody who's just had a bad meal that's finally come back on them in a very painful way. They had only one desire: to find a place to vomit this administration up. And they did not find it because of a carefully calculated strategy by the Republican leadership to prevent that strong desire from resulting in a decisive majority in the Congress of the United States. We are right now, right across the way from a state in which this was in evidence. The Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate in Virginia, Gillespie, may not have been, from a conservative point of view, the absolute cynosure of perfection. But on the most basic issues of principle, he had a track record of not wavering, and he ran a campaign that deserved success. Did he find it? He fell just this much short. Why? Why? Because at the end of the day, he was not given the kind of backing he should have been. At the end of the day, the Republican leadership, the Boehners and McConnells of the world, did not want the burden of responsibility of a majority that fell just shy of what was needed to kick this president from office, as he so richly deserves. And so all the talk now, even in the face, by the way, of clear declarations of criminal intent, I think that's what we've been witnessing in the days since the election from Barack Obama. Now, if anybody had any doubt that the various things we have seen with the aiding and abetting of the children's invasion, the violation of confidence and trust of Fast and Furious, the destruction of our interests at home and abroad in terms of our national security, I think the threat to openly employ what is clearly lawless, unconstitutional, and dictatorial power without any warrant in law in order to unilaterally legitimize this or that group of illegal immigrants into the United States. It's a clear declaration. I don't care about the law. That's what he's saying. I don't care about the law. I have no intention of wavering from what I feel must be done, simply because the people have expressed an adverse point of view. And I wonder how, in point of fact, things are going to unfold in 2015. I have to tell you, my sense of it is that the Republican leadership, since they no longer work for the people of the United States, will be seeking a way to fulfill the agenda of their true masters. And that agenda has been in evidence for several years, an agenda that has more and more destroyed the middle class, more and more appropriated the national income of the country to the benefit of a powerful few, more and more consolidated the control of resources in a country, by the way, that boasted of the most outstanding distribution of wealth of any country when I represented it in the United Nations in the 1980s, that had the strongest, most vibrant, most active and true middle class, in which we have seen that class, what Jefferson would have called the class of yeomen, farmers, professionals, businessmen, utterly put on the block and pretty much destroyed. So that now when you hear people speak of it, I saw this not long ago with Jimmy Carter, I think it was, standing up to say, well, the government needs to do something to help the middle class. And I think the government wouldn't have to do anything to help the middle class if it hadn't been busily destroying it for more than 10 years now, and hadn't appropriated and crushed under massive debt the hopes, the prospects, the opportunity that feeds the strength of that middle class and offers it hope. Wouldn't have to be done. But in that course of that time, what did we see? Well, we first saw on the part of the supposed opposition party, which at that time was in control of the Congress, from 2004 to 2006, we saw basically an abandonment of the Republican principles of fiscal responsibility. And I talked to people at the time that it didn't bode well for the future of the whole idea of disciplined, responsible self-government. You know why? Because if the guys who say that fiscal responsibility is their goal are practicing the same looting of the public purse for the purposes of building their political empire as the guys on the other side who openly profess to believe that government is the be-all and end-all, what's going to happen to the people themselves? They have no alternative. And it's been intriguing to me that whereas once our elections were about, what was that slogan of Jimmy Carter's that still included this word? Why not the best? Remember that slogan? Why not the best? Apparently when Jimmy Carter ran, it was not popular to believe that the best was the enemy of the good. See? You offered people the best because you thought this country was worthy of the best. What have we seen in recent years? More and more, especially as far as the constituents of the Republican Party are concerned, what we've seen is, well, he's not as bad as the other guy. That guy is so much worse, you better vote for this one. It looks like the whole question of the best has disappeared from the purview of American politics and the American people. And you can say, if you like, that that's just a kind of reflection of political cynicism with short-term consequences, but it's not true. And this is what I want to stress most of all in this little chat today. So, the abandonment of the standard of the best is actually a repudiation of the founding of the United States. It's a repudiation of the most fundamental idea on which the Republic rests. An idea that, by the way, I believe was drawn or drew upon the influence of Christianity and the example of Christ. Because Christ was a seek for the best kind of guy. You remember that? In a very serious way. For in spite of the fact that the standard that he raised is and was and will forever be completely out of the reach of our ordinary humanity, yet he did not forbear to invoke it as the guide and rule for our conduct. What did he say? What did he say? Be ye perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. He didn't say, make sure you're a little better than the devil. Make sure that you're not doing what the really bad people do. He didn't say that. He said, there's the standard of perfection. Reach for that standard. And you know why he said that, I think? He said it to make sure that we would challenge our heart and challenge our spirit until we reach the point where the abyss that stretches between our imperfection and the perfection of God was nonetheless a cry from our heart for the help of Almighty God in bridging that abyss, a help that he had already cheerfully offered in the person of his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. That's the logic of Christianity. You don't have to be afraid of the best when you know that God himself is ready to help you bridge the gap between your perfection, your imperfection, and his perfection. But I fear that in turning our back on the fundamental understanding of right and wrong that the country was founded on the standard that determines the difference, we embarked upon a course that becomes increasingly not a slow, not a deliberate, but a galloping path to hell. And I think more and more our people are feeling it. They're reaching that point where, though the flames haven't yet started to literally burn down their houses, yet the heat is being felt throughout this country. And on account of that heat, they looked up from their mesmerized slumbers after the last couple of elections and said, oh my gosh, These people are destroying my country. And though help wasn't really offered, yet they said, well, the only way we can register that we gotta do something about this mess is to vote for the people who are not Barack Obama, and who profess, at least with their lips, to stand against it. Now, I suppose that one should see, and we're certainly being invited to see, some more tremendous triumph and hope for America in the result of the last election. I sadly do not. And I think so far, at least, the Republican leadership has been doing their level best to confirm the skepticism of people like myself. Because they didn't come out of that election saying, we heard you. We will put a stop to these abuses. We will make sure that the Constitution of the United States is restored to a position of respect. Nothing of the kind. Instead, just as they did in the years after the 2010 election, they seem intent on actually putting more trust and confidence, reposing greater power and authority in the hands of a lawless president repudiated by the people of this country than they were doing before. And the only thing that we seemed assured of is that in the cooperation between the elitist faction leadership in the GOP and the elitist faction leadership in the Democrats, the elitist faction leadership in the GOP will have their turn to sup upon the wealth, the income, the power of the American people. Because that's all these people are doing now. They're like gangsters dividing up the territory. You see? And you know why that is? It's because, as I think was in evidence again in the aftermath of this last election, they apparently don't believe that they have just been elected to represent people. First words, practically, out of the mouth after the election is what? Okay, well, we're here to govern. We're going to govern. Here's how we'll govern. See? Congress of the United States, just by the by, is not about government. It's supposed to be about self-government. And the key to self-government for the American people is representation, not government itself. To represent the will of the people who elected you. To represent the heart of the people who have put you in place. To represent their conscience and their sense of what is best and better for their communities and their nation. That's the job of the Congress. And to make sure that in the process of doing that, those constraints upon power, which are required by right, are observed in everything that the government does. I remember long years ago going to a speech by Howard Phillips that stuck in my mind because he said in a very simple way something that was literally true and that we ought to call our attention to every now and again. When the folks who are elected as president, vice president, senators, congressmen in the United States, when they take office, do they swear to do a really good job? Do they swear to make sure that their constituents will get whatever they have coming? Do they swear to bring home the bacon, to bring home the dollars, to bring home the jobs, to bring this and that to their people? Is that what they swear? No, they don't. There's nothing in the oath of office about all of that. And the closest the Constitution comes to even discussing such things is the one thing that is being scrupulously disregarded by the folks who have not been elected, which is the president's responsibility faithfully to execute the laws. To keep faith with the law. Not to keep faith with phony promises of change, not to keep faith with phony largesse, not to keep faith with promises of welfare and caring for people who darn well ought to be and want to be taking care of themselves. That's not what they swear. What they swear is to uphold, protect, preserve, defend the Constitution of the United States. Why? Why on earth should the form of government be the single oath they take? The one thing that if they do not fulfill it, constitutes a clear, explicit, open violation of their trust with the people. Because the United States of America is founded on the belief that the Constitution represents an attempt to establish, on the basis of a true understanding of justice, the proper structures, institutions, and parameters of government. Now, the founders may not have been absolutely right about how those institutions would operate, how they should be put together from one moment to the next, but the commitment to the Constitution and to constitutional government means accepting that they were right about one thing. Right about the fact, informing the whole structure of our government, that justice is better achieved when it is a government of, by, and for the people than when it is a government conducted by a relatively irresponsible few. But are we preserving, by the way, the premise in this country today? We are not. And some folks would think, well, that's because, and then they'll start a litany of things that have them blaming the people. When I look back at the history of this country over my lifetime, you know what I see? I don't know whether I call it a conspiracy, because these days we're forbidden to do so. On my website, I constantly refer to it as a design for despotism. Because if you're going to fault me for calling it a design, then I suppose you're openly professing your belief that we should discard the principles of the Declaration of Independence. That's all right with me. See? Unlike the Republican leadership, I think and would be willing to fight all day long in a battle decided by the American people on the premise, should we or should we not reject the principles of the Declaration? And I believe on any day in which that contest is held in any degree fairly, the Declaration will win. Because people aren't nearly so stupid as our present elites think they are. They understand that the first time in the history of humanity, people who could have been rulers looked each other in the eye and said, that's not the right way to do things. And instead established a government that declared from the get-go the equality before God of ordinary folks. I think ordinary folks are smart enough to see that it's probably not a good idea to let that go. That for all the promises of short-term gain, we're going to give you jobs, we're going to give you welfare, we're going to give you this and that, we're going to give you a hedonistic culture that allows you to satisfy your sexual appetites in every way, inconceivable and conceivable, that you desire. And in exchange for that, which will keep you happy for a minute, all we want you to do is put yourself back in the same condition as the general run of humanity for the centuries and millennia before the United States was founded. Always living at the beck and call of those who claimed superior power, superior birth, superior status, who said that they were everything and you were nothing. Now, I was thinking today about that. Over the course of the last several days, I have seen several articles about the fact that the Kenyan bishops in Kenya, they just signed a letter, Catholic bishops, in which they were decrying what they say is substantial evidence that the tetanus vaccine being widely administered to people in Kenya is laced with a sterilizing chemical. Now, between you and me, I read this, and I said to myself, there it is. The answer to a question I've been asking myself for several years, really, since I first listened to a talk by Bill Gates. That was on the internet, one of those TED Talks things. And in this talk, which he gave several years ago, he was talking about the problem of population and what a burden the existence of humanity is for the earth, and how we have to relieve this with a drastic reduction, and I mean drastic reduction, in our population. He said, some people say we can't do that and so forth, but I think we can realistically, Bill Gates said, achieve a rate of decline in this population. And among the mechanisms that he listed, he said vaccination, vaccines. Now, I gotta confess, I may be an ignoramus from way back, this is true, but I have always been under the impression that vaccinating people was about helping them to live longer and healthier lives because they wouldn't be prey to debilitating diseases. Anybody who thinks that, raise your hand. That's what I thought. And here I have Bill Gates telling me that we're going to control. Now, controlling the population means that you have fewer people staying alive. Why bother to vaccinate people if you want more of them to die? But I realize now, I saw this report about the bishops, put it up with a link to his talk to give people a sense of how these two things might be related. See, not a conspiracy, mind you, just a design. But, and one of the people who commented on it commented that it didn't sound like the worst idea in the world to him that people who had no useful skills to offer the 21st century should be kept from birth. Digest that. Right? I thought we defeated the Nazis, didn't you think that? I thought we fought this long and terrible war so that the Goebbels and Mengeles of the world, for whom this kind of thinking was the norm, would not rule the earth. And yet, Bill Gates, seconded apparently by this friend of mine who won't be a friend much longer on Facebook, they sort of believed that, well, we should think about this. This is not a bad idea. Now leave aside for the moment the question of whether or not the whole, I think, quite deceitful belief that population is in and of itself an evil should be accepted. I always tell people that if it is acceptable to believe that that is the case, I guess that the Japanese should have practiced mass sterilization. And yet they have been one of the most successful countries in the world at caring for their people, and more than that, earning their way in the world. How did they manage that with a population density that puts America in the shade when it comes to such things? So it doesn't seem to me that it's a valid argument to say the population in and of itself is the problem, but that's not in any case what really outraged me about this business of putting chemicals, if it is true, in a tetanus vaccine. Do you know what outraged me? What outraged me was remembering what I believe, deeply, by the way, as an American. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent. Not from the capacity to deceive, not from the ability by power and force to coerce, but from the consent of the government. A consent which, as we know, was supposed to be derived, supposed to be arrived at in the thinking of the founders by folks who were presented in a reasonable way with alternatives that would be argued in light of a reasonable standard of right and wrong. And I guess you'd be right to ask me where I get these ideas. How can I say that that's what the founders done? This fellow, by the way, who made a little comment about my juxtaposition on Facebook said, well, there goes Keyes again. That's his Catholic point of view, because I am Catholic. And I chuckled to myself. I said, well, I'm perfectly happy that it happens to coincide with the understanding of truth that the Catholic Church raised me in. But I make every argument I make, every single one, in terms of the principles on which this nation was founded. Principles clearly stated in the Declaration of Independence, and to which most of our so-called leaders still don't have the guts to take exception, even though a lot of them have discarded it long ago. And by the way, in case you think I'm just talking about nasty, bad old Marxist Obama and socialist thises and that's, I'm also talking about, I don't know, the Ryans of the world and the Rand Pauls of the world who embraced godless Ayn Rand as if that is not in utter, absolute contradiction with the possibility of justice in the United States. Because the very idea of justice in America is defined explicitly as a matter of right. Is this not so? That's why that word occurs so much in our vocabulary. Every time you turn around, somebody's going to be talking about their rights, claiming their rights, defending their rights, going into court to sue over their rights. Rights are just a major preoccupation of the people of this country. Why is that? Well, could it have anything to do with the fact that we're founded on the premise that all human beings are created, not granted by their government, not empowered by their leaders, not inspired by the charismatic example of the wonderful few, but endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable, meaning rights inseparable from their identity as human beings. Pause for a minute and try to think about, what does that mean? Well, it's something we've heard, it's a concept we rely on, but what does it mean? What does it mean to be endowed with rights? Some people, including sort of Rand Paulists and Ayn Randists of the world, they stop at the notion that it's freedom. It means freedom, right to freedoms. Well, tell me something. Let's say that you live next door, have a farm next door to somebody who owns vast amount of land and has a huge number of servants and so forth. And he looks across your way. By the way, you'll see some similarity between this and a little story that was told to King David, as I recall. And he looks across the way, and he sees something he wants. Maybe it's a nice little pool of clear, clean water that he doesn't have on his property. He sees something he wants on the property of his neighbor, and he goes, and he sends a lot of his servants over there and says, take over that farm, kick those people out. He's a very powerful guy, and the people who own the farm don't have the power to resist him. Therefore, that power makes him free, doesn't it? To do as he pleases. So he goes across, he takes the land, and so forth and so on. Thankfully, as it turns out, that little farm is located in the United States of America. And so, what does the little farmer who owns it do? They go to court. And they say, against all right, against my right, this man has by power taken my land, stolen it out from under me. Okay? I want this court to uphold my right. Well, here we go. The guy who doesn't have the freedom to occupy the land nonetheless goes into court to claim the right to occupy it. And you and I both think that makes sense, don't we? Sure it does. We have no problem at all then seeing the distinction between right and freedom. Freedom is what you can do by power. Right is what you are free to do by permission of law and justice, and according to our declaration, Almighty God. Is that so? That's clear. That's easy to understand. And totally abandoned in our discourse now. Where, on the side that's supposed to be the champion of conservative values, we have leaders almost to a man who understand right in terms of freedom, rejecting the truth, that in fact it invokes a standard of right, and that standard of right is explicitly connected in the foundational organic law of the United States with the will of the Creator God. Last point here. If what I just said is true, and the founders believed that upholding the Constitution derived from that understanding of right, which then is the basis for saying that the only just government, the only just powers of government are those that are based upon and wielded with respect for the consent of the people. Yeah? So our whole thing, and that's the way the Constitution is framed, isn't it? The whole Constitution. That's why some of the more awkward things that are in there as constraints on government and procedures that make it more difficult just to get things done. See? Why did they do that? They did it so that justice would be served. An understanding of justice inseparable from right. Inseparable, therefore, from the God-implanted, God-ordained, God-programmed inclination to do right, which then leads people who are lovers of justice and seekers of justice to come together in order to form a community in which the thirst for justice and the willingness to do what is right will not be a sacrifice, will not be a danger, will not be a threat, but instead will be a source of common strength, a source of common confidence, a source of that integrity which allows people, whatever may be their material differences, nonetheless to live together in peace. That's the understanding of things that our country's founded on. But that's not the understanding that our leaders are presently basing their approach to politics on, and I think I can prove it and do all the time, chapter and verse. You can hardly see anything that's going on any given day in this country, but you see an example of how they are abandoning the premise, as Madison put it, that justice is the end of government. Not prosperity, not the consolidation of power, not prestige, but justice. And an understanding of justice that clearly requires that we limit our use of freedom with respect to the authority of Almighty God and the impulses of right which he has woven into the very fabric of our nature, written, as St. Paul said, on our hearts. That's what we're supposed to have. Instead, what we have is pragmatists. Pragmatists. Unfortunately, because of my outward appearance, which does correspond, of course, inwardly to a certain heritage, that's not unimportant, but because of my outward appearance, I get lots of people who are constantly emailing me and writing me and sending me stuff that they think I'm supposed to have, heard about Ben Carson, think he's a wonderful guy, and why don't we have Ben Carson do this and Ben Carson do that? And I'll tell you, I have seen him, among others, as a prime example of the problem here. Prime example of the problem. So I heard about him because he gave a speech at the prayer breakfast. Everybody said it was wonderful, and I'm always willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. Now, I read it, didn't exactly find it very compelling. As a matter of fact, I didn't find much in it at all. It was a nice speech that was along the lines of a very sound and common sense understanding that I did get from my mother, which is that you should make it a priority in life to get a good education because it's something nobody can take away from you. I think that basically summarized the speech. And it was a nice, laudable speech in that regard. Now, what it had to do with the great issues that are the challenges to justice and principle in America, I can't tell you. But there it was. That was the speech he gave. And everybody was praising it and telling me I should take a look at Ben Carson. He's a wonderful guy. Still, I suspend disbelief. Okay, I don't see the proof of that here, but I'll wait. Well, what I regard as the proof of the pudding came in this recent election, just as it did for many of the GOP leaders. Given a choice between supporting somebody who actually believes in and advocates, stands on vital issues that rest on the premise that we're all created equal and endowed by our Creator, not our mother's choice, not our legislator's choice, not our president's choice, but the choice of Almighty God, with unalienable rights that no powerful government, no powerful individual, no all-controlling parent or other guardian has any right to violate. We're endowed by God with those rights. Given that understanding, how do you apply that understanding to the issue of human life in the womb? That's pretty self-evident, isn't it? You got to respect it. Well, child has just as much right in the womb, outside of the womb, when it's just a tiny little newborn fertilized bunch of cells, and later when it emerges from the womb. And even when, in the aggravation of time, they turn into teenagers and stuff and try our patience, you still have to remember that they have rights that come from Almighty God, and it's your job to implement the benevolent will of God toward them, not act on your passionate feelings of the moment, right? So, I think that's an issue that once you evoke the principles of the Declaration, I think she's fairly simply decided. It's easy. Poses no difficulty at all. Not at least for somebody who's standing up and going to prayer breakfast and claiming that he's going to appeal to folks who believe in life issues. There was a contest going on in which one individual in that contest for the U.S. Senate out in, Oregon, was a strong pro-life, and the other person was an open advocate of the so-called pro-choice, actually pro-abortion position. Right? And I say that because we have to be careful with letting people get away with this debasement of our language. They put that fast one in about pro-choice. And now it turns out that whether you're talking about the choice to kill your babies or the choice to have sexual relations, so-called, why it's called sexual when the sexual difference has nothing to do with it, I don't know. But they call it sexual. With relation to somebody of the same sex as you. Now we no longer have the right not to do that. You do realize that. They started out saying this was going to be all about somebody's choice. But now we're given no choice but to pay for evil. We're given no choice but to execute evil, but to carry out evil, but to stand before God tainted by the lack of courage that led us to choose life and prosperity over allegiance to his truth, sacrificing our very souls and our prospect of salvation in order to stand before the law of a lawless government. So it looked like choice was not involved. And why, in the end, could one take this position that, well, it's okay to support somebody who advocates what has now been clearly demonstrated to be an assault on the most fundamental rights of conscience? How do you get there? Well, Ben Carson, who supported, what was her name? Monica Waby, right? Did I get that right? He justified that on the grounds that he was a pragmatist. I'm a pragmatist. I believe you just work with people to get things done, and Monica Waby will go to Washington and get things done. You know, in a country founded on an understanding of right, you can't simply let somebody tell you they're going to get things done. You got to ask them a simple question. Are they the right things or the wrong things? Are you going to do right or wrong according to the standard of right and wrong, that's not dictated by your selfish interest, not dictated by your political advantage, not even dictated by the will of the majority, but dictated by the standards of the Creator God, so that every human being equally may lay claim to that justice? What you going to do? That's the question you should ask. But apparently the question that Ben Carson didn't ask. Now, I don't single him out just because I think some special reason. No. I single him out because it's a sad example of what is becoming increasingly pervasive. That even in the party that lately became a Republican. See, that proof that he was going to be pragmatic, I suppose, that made him, a persona grata with the present betraying leadership of the Republican Party. Because that's what you have to do. Whatever else you may do, whatever else you may stand for, you must make the choice that betrays the principles of self-government. What happens if we go on accepting a choice between the great evil that openly declares that the goal is tyranny and the lesser evil that simply abandons the premises of truth, making tyranny inevitable? What's going to happen? We shall end up enslaved. Now, I've been saying this for 20, 30 years. I hate to say it, because it's a little hard to think I'm that old. I don't feel that old, but here I am. Simple fact, though. I've saying it for a long time. And at one time, it was just a kind of speculation. Because at one time, freedom of conscience meant that you didn't have to pay for somebody else's abortion, even if you were being forced to tolerate laws that said that they can go ahead and kill the innocent, which your faith and God himself says is wrong, right? Well, people thought they'd get away with that. Well, we'll still be able to pray over here. We'll still be able to preach over here. That you have noticed, haven't you? That what was supposed to be all about somebody else's right to do what they want has now turned into a discussion of how wrong it is for you to maintain your relationship with God in the way your faith demands. You think that's an accident? Not an accident. It's an inevitable effect of the surrender of the perfect standard of truth. And I think that brings me back to where this discussion began. It brings me back to that guy who wouldn't let go of the standard standard of truth, who didn't think the lesser evil was enough, and who said, doing Jimmy Carter one better, seek after the best. Go for the best. Accept only the best as the standard of your action and the goals of your children and the ultimate purpose of your association with other human beings. The breathtaking thing is that determination was the foundation of America. Now, when I say that, does that mean, oh, everybody in America was saint? Well, in the early colonies, we do remember, don't we, that people were not at all ashamed of calling themselves saints. A lot of the Puritans referred to each other as the saints. We still have that, though it's a little less referred to than it used to be among the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. See, we're going to be like those other saints, and we're going to say whatever may be the rightness, wrongness of our understanding. Leave that aside. It was not at all understood to be somehow out of the reach of our communities, of our association, of our politics, that we should strive to be saints, and that justice in our political communities had to accommodate that, in fact existed in order to accommodate that goal. It wasn't at all considered to be something unheard of and terrible that violated the fundamental premise of separation of church and state and all this. No. It was in fact articulated in the Declaration. It was sought after in the provisions of the Constitution. And it is supposed to be still both the motivation and the goal of our polity, the goal of justice. Interesting thing is that for all they are now denigrated and belittled and besmirched in every way that our elites can think of, our founders were clear as Madison, that justice is the aim, that it must be pursued, that right is the standard that must be respected. And what came of it? They all pretend to be empiricists. You can only discuss things in terms of our empirical science. What is the empirical science of humanity anyway? By and large, you don't get to do experiments on human beings, not of any sort that's really going to test them to their limit, right? That's called murder and stuff. And it's generally considered to be bad unless you happen to be a Nazi or something, right? So how do we base our approach to human affairs on quote science? I remember Harriet Myers being nominated and a speech being discovered, which she had said to a group that no issue should be a subject of our politics that cannot be discussed on a scientific basis. And I pointed out that, well, that whole premise, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, I don't think science can validate that one, do you? And that means the whole way of life injustice, the whole claim that leads people to do what they do in America. We got to be concerned with the poor. We've got to be concerned with the voiceless. We've got to be concerned with the oppression of those whom power abuses. Why do we have to be concerned with that? Because Marx says so? Because history says so? That's all garbage. History says nothing of the kind. History says that the strong rule. History says that justice is the will of the last man standing. But our Declaration said something different. Our Declaration said that whatever you and I may think, there are no such thing as useless eaters. There are no such thing as people who, because they don't offer useful skills to the 21st century, as this interlocutor of mine on Facebook says, can therefore be exterminated in concept before they are born. Because that's what sterilization is about. It's just another way of perpetrating Holocaust against the very idea of humanity. Because if all we are is that which makes us useful to others, then in the end, we can be useless enough to be discarded by those others when they have Do we plan to return this country to that basis? See? People talk a lot these days about saving America, save America. And yes, we face security threats, and we obviously are facing economic difficulties, a lot of them due to the self-worshipping and deceitful policies being pursued by people who claim they're doing it for our good. Right? We face all of that. But I don't believe that any of that is ultimately what's at stake when we say we want to save our country. It's not what makes America distinct, what made it a beacon of hope, drawing people of every race and creed and color and kind to the shores of our land. It's not what informed the struggles that freed the slaves and lifted up the workers and emancipated people from the shackles of social expectations that kept them from fulfilling their God-given talents and making use of their God-given abilities. No. What did that was that simple premise, that we have before God an equal responsibility to do what is right, to reach for what is best in the eyes of God. And when we do so, no government, no power on earth has any authority to stand against us. For when we are right with God, we have the freedom that only His right provides. Are we ready to abandon that premise? Because that's what our leaders are doing. That's what they have already done. And if we do not find a way to call them back to that truth, to rebuke them for their abandonment of that which made this nation a beacon and light of hope to all humanity from the moment that it was founded, then we shall lose the nation that we love. And we shall deserve the condemnation and opprobrium of our posterity, such of them as survive our ruthless and murderous ambitions, and the condemnation of our God. For in the end, it is He who lifts up the kings and casts down the thrones. He set the people of the United States upon a throne of liberty. And for a while there, generation after generation struggled with the demons in themselves to free the light that God instilled within them. And just when breaking through the deepest throes of darkness, we lifted up that beacon hope to shine throughout the world. Our leaders now are tearing that hope down and plunging our nation into the darkness that must come when we have abandoned the simple truth in which our hope and identity lays. The simple truth that we are all created equal and endowed by God with our responsibility for right, endowed by God with our ability, whatever our station or background, to stand in the little way we can, to stand in the bigger ways we must, in vindication of that right, which by His will and authority is the only justice that endures. Thank you.
You spoke about Ben Carson, who recently said he was putting his hat in the ring for the presidency for the Republican Party. Do you see anyone in our midst that you would support moving forward in the next election?
No, not yet. And I actually think, that it's kind of worrisome. We're on a day right now where worrisome things are happening. And I don't know exactly how they're being conducted and stuff, but the way it's being done can't possibly really be good. Okay, because, well, where do we get off having these discussions from a pool of folks before those chosen by the most recent will of the people have had a chance to show us what they can do, or what they refuse to do. And whether you're talking about Congress, and who should be the leaders in Congress? Should we assume that the leaders in Congress should be the people who just spent the last several years betraying the promises they made the last time they were handed an opportunity to lead? I don't know. That strikes me as not very sensible. And as I recall, in the 19th century, newly elected freshman people could get elected to leadership positions depending on who they were. So if you happen to be a guy like John Quincy Adams, you didn't have to sit in the back on the back bench when you got to Congress, because everybody knew who you were. They trusted you, and they were going to vote for you for a leadership position. Why not? Then we've allowed the system to debase itself, to become essentially a vapid, stupid, bureaucratic mess, where people are being promoted on the basis of how long they can warm the seat instead of how well they can represent the heart of our people. And I hope we'll find a way to do something about that, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. And that would mean to me what? I think we could be entering a really critical 2 years here. A couple of thoughts. Step number one. Before we get into talking 2016 and all this, let's look at what the possibilities are. I think encouraged by the feckless response of the GOP leadership, Barack Obama is the most openly dictatorial and tyrannical president this country has ever seen. He leaves Andrew Jackson, who was all excoriated by his contemporaries as a tyrant and all, leaves him in the shade. They actually censured him, and he took it to heart, too. And it was eventually, the vote was reversed because he found it, they didn't want to leave that stain on his record. That was in the days when people in Congress still thought that it was their job to keep the executive in line with the Constitution. And not, by the way, to make stupid gestures toward a court that doesn't even have the power to do anything. This is what Boehner did. I'm going to run to the court and I'm going to sue him for violating the Constitution. The court can't really do anything about the president's violations. Nothing in the Constitution says that the Supreme Court has the right to boot him out of office, to chastise him, to do anything to him, or his administration. Only the Congress has that. When you turn to somebody who's got no power, and you've got the power to do what you're asking them to do, that's a con job, if I ever saw one. And that's what we've been subject to for the last several years. So sadly, I think over the next 2 years, there's going to be a measure of this. But will there be folks who will stand for the business of calling this whole administration, this whole faction, to account for its lawlessness? They keep calling it lawlessness. They called it lawlessness every other day. But last time I looked, if you're the one who has the power to curb lawlessness and you don't use it, what does that make you? An accomplice in lawlessness. And so now we're electing the accomplices in lawlessness to renew their leadership position in the Congress and asking ourselves which of these people who've been tolerating lawlessness should be running for president of the United States. No, thank you. Got no interest in them, any of them. Because they have had no interest in saving this country from the first individual I know of in American history who could actually, where I can actually see the path by which he brings our nation down. And that could unfold in the next 2 years. We better hope, like people who are driving without car insurance, we better hope that we don't have any major accidents over the next 2 years. Because one instance of an episode general enough to require the declaration of martial law and our way of life is gone. And anybody who doesn't believe it isn't awake yet. This is the most dangerous period in the history of our country. And I don't see yet anybody on the horizon who has the wisdom. It's not just a matter of courage. It's not just a matter of speaking. It's a matter of showing the wisdom to be the repository of this nation's hope in a period when it all is going to come to a head, right? It's like the moment in war when the whole battle focuses on the head of the general. There was a time during the Civil War when the Union, the whole Republic of the United States, existed only one place, and that was in the heart and mind of Abraham Lincoln, who carried it through the war that otherwise divided the country. How did he hand it back to us? How did he hand it back to the people? By taking every opportunity he could to evoke the founding principles that united us in justice before God. And when he had done it again and again in the midst of the travails of war, never wavering from his willingness to look at that beacon light, he handed it back to a people confirmed in the understanding that that founding premise of God's justice was the reason men had fought, the reason they had died, the reason people now would live for the sake of their sacrifice. Is this what our leaders tell us these days? I'm sorry, y'all. They tell us that we must inaugurate the abandonment of that right in every possible way, so that the people who have died in the service of those ideals and principles shall have died in vain because of us. We shall lose what they died to preserve. We shall surrender what they lived to hand on to us.
Alan, I get the last question before we whisk you away to the next talk. By the way, Alan is speaking 5 more times in the next 2 days. He has to speak at 3 o'clock up in Gaithersburg. So the final question is this. Who do you see, Alan, who embodies the values of the Declaration and constitutional values, who would make a good replacement for Speaker Boehner?
Well, see, in our present situation, I don't think it's about to happen. But I personally know somebody. For reasons I've gotten to know him, well, Boehner's, I know some people, talked to him somewhat, because my son works for him. And he stood impressively for life and for all the things that I believe in, including security and border security and everything else, and has been willing to take the lumps. And Boehner's been dishing out lumps, and is now rudely promising to dish out some more to anybody who dares to represent their constituents. No? We're going to get the worst of both worlds. We're going to get the iron discipline of a parliamentary system without the ability to kick them out wholesale when they betray us. Isn't that sad? That's the worst thing possibly. That's where we are now, because that's the way Boehner has behaved. And the individual I'm talking about is somebody like Louis Gohmert. I have yet to have somebody come to me and say, "Oh, I hate Louis. Look at what he said. Look at what he did." And so, even when it was difficult. So that's the kind of person I'd replace Boehner with. He stands for something, and he doesn't stand for it because of the power he's going to get out of it. As a matter of fact, he's been taking knocks and lumps and been pushed to the back of the bus, just like me. Okay? So when I find people sitting down with their lumps and bleeding from their wounds, I take that seriously. I take it really seriously. So yeah, I think somebody like that, wouldn't have to be Louis Gohmert, but it would be somebody who had been taking that kind of a stand and doing it consistently over the course of the time that people have given them an office. Not some accommodator, not some pragmatist who has been willing for the sake of lying promises to betray the promise of the country.
Let me ask just one question aside. Alan,
And this is the last question.
Alan can answer me quickly, but were you surprised on Supreme Court Justices John Roberts coming out and saying that there was a tax, Obamacare?
Actually, no, I wasn't.
And you based that on having studied him?
Well, I studied him. When he was nominated, you do what you do. You read it, what everybody says, and then look at the background and so forth. And I mean no disparagement, because this may sound like a little bit of a personal remark, but it's not. It's a remark about the philosophy exemplified in a person's career, right? And the thing that gave me pause about Justice Roberts was that he was, in the parlance of the present profession, in the ethos of the present profession, he was a lawyer's lawyer. He was somebody who kind of reflected the way the wind blows in the legal profession of our time, right? And that means, to me, that even if you look good, even if you look like a flourishing tree, your roots are in sand. Whoops! And you're not going to stand when the wind blows hard. You're going to topple. And so when he toppled, I said, yep, guess I was right about that. Mm-hmm. See? Guess he was looking for a way to accommodate, looking for a way to stay somehow on the side of that professional ethos in a situation where he could take a decision that was constitutionally, I think, quite intolerable, And meanwhile look like he was serving the tactics of the day, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure he went to bed that night thinking, God, wow, look at how smart I am. See, I would rather have people go to bed thinking, God, look at how principled I am. You know, looking at the people and saying, I upheld my oath today because the Constitution still lives. And I haven't struck a blow against its meaning. So yeah, yeah, but how many of the people on the Supreme Court, and how many of them do I repose as the things as my faith and confidence? Two, yeah. And one of them, for not maybe such good reasons, he has a good track record, that's why. Because I can explain to you why even there I have the expectation that at some point when push comes to shove, we will see the lack of rootedness in principle. And the only one I don't think will show that, but you never know, is Justice Thomas. And maybe that's because I know him really well, and I could be biased, but I know him really well means that I know how deeply rooted he is in the natural law tradition, in the tradition that does not reject the fundamental premise of the Declaration. And the fundamental premise of the Declaration is clear. We are all created equal and endowed by our Creator with our rights. Now, what I cannot fathom is why the American people haven't awakened wholesale to a simple truth. Anybody who rejects the idea of the superintendent intelligence of the Creator rejects the Declaration and therefore rejects the claim of the people to govern themselves based upon the Declaration. No one has ever come up with a better claim for the people to be the repository of political power, the ultimate wielders of sovereignty in the society in which they live. Nobody has come up with a better one. I don't think anybody's actually come up with a viable alternative at all. Every other one leads simply to the place of power, to the superiority of power and force and might and sometimes of malignant will. See, because if you're willing to lie enough, you can also get your hands on power and keep it and call it justice. No one's ever come up with such a decent, clean, pure way of looking people in the eye and saying, you are my anointed ones. I lift you to the sovereign throne that governs your country's fate. And I doubt that anybody will ever find a better one. And the people of the United States, we're going to be toppled from that throne because we have let go of the simple premise of the benevolent will of our Creator.